Okay, so basically this week we're going to focus on, I would hope, a brief session for those of you working on the final paper. Remember, it's only 5 or 10 pages. It's not that long. Less is more. Mark Twain, the American author, said, you know, something like, give me a year and I'll write 1,000 words. Give me a day, I'll write 10,000 words. It is harder to write less, but I'm just going to give you some advice, which is essentially to say, if you feel like you're taking on too much, do less. Less is more. Edit it out. It's very hard for all of us who are very curious and we want to be, I know all of you are great students who want to, give a good impression, we also have to realize for every analysis there is a boundary. If you feel like you have too much and I'm grading your paper, you got to know who your TA is. It's okay if you put it into an appendix. But again, for undergrads, keep it to 5 pages. Graduate students, keep it to 10 pages. And I'm not going to focus too much on the sort of the pro forma stuff in terms of like what are the requirements for the assignments, except to say that well, the examples we give don't have abstracts, but what you're writing is really very close to a scientific paper in its general sense. And it doesn't have to be groundbreaking. We're not judging you by the results. And I have found it in my own life and when I talk to students, they feel more often than not, students are feeling like they need to say more to be impressive or something like that. No, I think it's your first time. We've all started research in the same place. I had a point in my life, I remember my first stats class, we used Excel. I was terrified. Okay. Don't worry, it'll be okay. And the tips I'm giving you are just general recommendations. Just if you have the time, if you want to do a review, go ahead and check it out. And I think this is always useful to do when you do a final paper. And if you're still writing it, I think this will also be helpful. So let me share my screen. I'm going to share my desktop. I'm going to actually might see some of my controls here. I want to move the controls because those seem to be in the way. So nice to see a nice empty desktop, sort of a tabula rasa. I wrote up some notes here, and I have those as a PDF. And I'll be able to, I'll post those on the course website under files. And I also have some articles. But again, these are my tips. They're not requirements to grade. There's nothing required. I'm going to go down here. Actually, I'm going to state this right here. There's no one way to write a research report, and this in no way comprises a universal key for writing a research report. The point of these tips are to share my thoughts to ensure the writing decisions that you make are conscious. In other words, again, I always say this, it's your education. It was one of my best friends in graduate school. I was nervous. I wanted to impress the professors. And he said, no, it's your education. Sure, they let you into Harvard, but you own that education. You own the certification of the class. It is yours. You're paying for it. We work for you. Keep that in mind, because the point here is not that these tips are ways to think about things. The only way to think about things. They're just piece of advice that I have from talking to so many students that I thought might be helpful. Before we, when we talk about that, I want to first show you the sort of an abstract. And again, this is a matter of taste. I want to go to the last points before we even talk about this. Ignore every other bit of advice if it interferes with your own voice or undermines the clarity of the manuscript. The point is to communicate. That's it. These are guidelines and opinions. I would say opinionated guidelines. People can disagree with me. They will. And beyond the broad scope of the class assignment, there's considerable flexibility in how you choose to write and interpret the data. And I would say if you're struggling or curious. In other words, if you're thinking, oh gosh, I don't know where my voice is, or I'm not sure what this is, I'm not going to tell you that you need reassurance, because you don't need reassurance on how to write. You have a voice. In fact, one of the examples I'm going to show is a paper I co-authored with someone who has a very different voice than I do. And I'm using this to show the example of an abstract. This is an online academic paper repository, and it's an analysis I wrote with a psychologist and someone else as well. I want to show you a couple things. First of all, our abstract is way too long. Okay, this is pre-publication. This is an online paper. It's a SSRN. A lot of people will do this now in academia. They'll publish a paper before it gets published because they want it to be publicized. What I really want to show to you is this. Look how many people viewed the abstract versus people who downloaded the paper. This is academia. This is a lot of the kind of data science you might see. The most important people who will be reading a manuscript will probably not read your paper. They're going to read the title. They're going to read the abstract. They'll even see the authors, and they'll see where we are. Right, here we are. There I am with the vision of continuing education. And you also see, for a lot of reasons, this paper does not fit the scope of the class. It's an academic paper. So keep in mind, we live in a world, as one book editor called it, this is the editor of MIT Press, she said, we live in a wiki world. That means we live in a world in which there's distraction everywhere, you know. It's hard to grab people's attention, especially when you're reporting important, complex material. So the point of a title, I would say, before we get there, is to tell you what's going on without ever having to read anything. So the best titles actually have the conclusion here. This is going to be jargony, but what we're saying here in the title is our main finding. P-curving a more comprehensive body of research on postural feedback. Our method reveals clear evidential value for power posing effects. So we did a meta-analysis, and we showed that, according to Amy Cuddy's work, she had the most popular TED Talk. She showed power posing seems to work. And you stand up tall, you feel better. And what we showed is that these critics had a biased sample. Now, of course, there's a lot of jargon here. The title's long, but for the most important people, the people who are decision makers, the most interested people, they're going to read this and they're going to know what the finding is. And the first part here is essentially the method. P-curving is a tool, and we're talking about the data, and then we talk about the subject. And when we say reveals, we're saying this is the outcome of our research. Power posing effects are real if you collect all the data. This is a big issue in a lot of science, is how biased is your sample, even with meta-analysis, which is, meta-analysis is when you take a whole bunch of studies and you combine them and try to assess whether there's a causal effect. And the last part, we're saying we're replying to these critics who also had a blog post. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to show you. The rest of this isn't that important, and the abstract is not necessarily the best here because this is actually too long. It's longer than 300 words, which is what we have. But the main point is people are going to read the title and they're going to read the abstract, and then they're not going to download the paper. When it gets published in the academic journal, I'm sure we'll get more citations and views and stuff. But the point is, these are the most important points. I would say, if you want to, as advertisers say, break through the clutter. They're not requirements. I'm not going to punish you, and I know I'm guilty of breaking all of these rules, of making an article as boring. But if you can do something in the title, as one of my mentors had done, he used to always talk about what he called a title of the ages. And he was this old sociologist from the 1960s named Dan Bell. Wrote two of the most famous books in sociology. One was called The End of Ideology and the Exhaustion of Ideas. Good title, The End of Something. And the other one was called the coming of the post-industrial society. He predicted the coming of the new post-industrial society. These are thick books, really big ones that I don't know if people read. But the main point is, think of these as guidelines. There's no one way to voice things. And I say this with the work with Professor Cuddy, Amy Cuddy, is because she actually has a very nice voice. She works at business school. Has a great TED Talk. And I can see when we write the paper together, I sound much more, I use a lot more $10 words that aren't necessary. I sound more technical. I sound more quanty. I can see that difference. And it was a challenge for us to sort of merge our writing as collaborators. And that's okay. And that's okay to have your voice, just to have it sing. And I think we need more of that actually in science. Okay. So when we talk about abstracts, keep in mind your goal, and this is just in life really, is to keep the reader's job as easy as possible. Assume the person is on their iPhone looking away. Imagine you're in a party with 20 other people telling you their spiel. We talk about it, we call it an elevator speech in job talks. You're in the elevator, what do you say to the most famous scholar in your field who has thousands of adoring people who doesn't know who you are? What do you tell them? Well, that's kind of what the abstract is. A nice abstract will summarize the main findings of the paper. And it should stand on its own. And the title should as well. I've also seen titles that are meant to grab that are kind of humorous. One of my favorites was a critique of the use of the p-value that we've talked about. The title was, "The Earth is round, p is less than 0.05. I was making sort of a silly joke about how for so many phenomena that we're interested in, our null hypothesis, the fact that we're interested in it, probably already means that the null hypothesis is going to be rejected if we had a large enough sample. But I remember that title. Another title was like The Strength of the Weak State. Another one, some people do plays on words. Another famous sociology paper was The Strength of Weak Ties, weak social ties. It showed that with job referrals, people you know less, the weaker the tie is, the more information you get. Instead of keeping close to your friends, your strong ties. If you know a friend of a friend that you don't know, there's a strength in that weak tie. So you don't have to be that creative. Don't think too much about it. But I've noticed that when I focus on things, I often notice if you want your paper to be read or you want your memo to break through the bureaucratic clutter, start with what it is you want to say and keep it clear. And again, I'm putting a caveat here. I got a lot of text here. I wrote too much in saying this. But I would say to keep the reader's job as easy as possible, you want to tell them before you tell them. You tell them, then you repeat, then you tell them after you tell them. There's going to be some repetition. So for example, in this paper, if you look at the paper manuscript, and here's an example of it. First of all, it's too long, but you'll see that I want to show it to you because it's the same thing, except you'll see we have a title page here. So we try to make it as easy as possible because you can see already on this first page where it's going, when it was written, who the people are, and also what the main finding is. Again, you don't have to do this much. You don't have to do your affiliation. In fact, it looks like we don't have our abstract here. I'm scrolling down to see if we have, no, because we posted the abstract on the other page. So for those who download it, we're not exactly doing the same thing as you guys do, but essentially we have an introduction, we have background, and all of this here is to say, this is what we're doing, and this is what we found right here. These analyses that we've done, which is more studies, stand in contrast to those of the other people. And it's less comprehensive. And it led them to conclude that our findings do not possess evidential value. Well, we showed the opposite. So for the impatient reader, they'll go to the introduction, get a little more detail. They'll go to the conclusion. This is for the most impatient reader. And they might go to, say, This is a very long conclusion. Hold on for a second. Oh, see, we have notes. We have that? Skipping that. Well, not really. Okay, so this is a little different than a normal paper. If we had a conclusion, it kind of fits right here. What do these analyses tell us about the evidence of blah, 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 postural feedback? And then we sort of end here, and we're just basically saying, how did two groups of researchers come up with different conclusions? And we come to our conclusions as to why this happened. And we're not arguing that those results are incorrect, da, da, da. Our findings include modest support for the general literature on postural feedback, and da, da, da. So again, here we're repeating our main finding. We're saying, again, in more broad terms, they support the research. And we should continue to support this. And then here are the notes. Here's some more devil is in the details. Most people will probably, if they're going to read something, they'll read this last part, which is going to be your oh, there's the discussion. Yeah, there it is. And you can even see like a subheading here. You don't have to do that. But these, again, people will also tend to read the subheadings. These are just sub-findings. So it sounds like we find what is called evidential value. We find support that your posture will affect aspects of your mood and maybe even aspects of your behavior, but less so. It'll also make you feel more powerful subjectively. Stand tall. Here's the nitty gritty. Here's our results. It's almost all graphical. We do an omnibus test. It's certainly my language. But yeah, that's the research, and then there's the interpretation of the research. So we kind of follow that same method. Of course, this is way too much. Analytic approach would be our method. So you're doing methods and results in the same thing, and then you have methods and results in the same section. Again, this is too long. But basically, you still have the same kind of approach. You have sort of, okay, why is this, what's going on? Why is this important? What are we saying? But if you just look at the first few lines of any academic paper, you'll see what the main research is. In the last part, you'll see sort of the implication, which is our argument is these other critics of this literature had a bias sample. And any bias sample based on a small n is not strong enough if you don't include all the relevant information. It's a bias sample. I know it doesn't follow exactly what's going on, but I just want to clearly show to you the work that I do, the work that we all do, continues to follow this sort of format, and that just imagine that this impatient reader. Think of someone, the more important the person is, the less time he or she will have, the more critical that person will probably likely to be, because that person is used to having very strong opinions about things. I noticed this when talking with several important people. They'll say, well, hasn't this been done before? They won't even know that they're being totally critical and maybe crushing your 6 years of work for your dissertation, or 10 years, or whatever. So anyway, long story short, to be as clear as possible, you're gonna have a title here. You're going to have an introduction that will basically answer, that will kind of preface the whole story. What is it you're going to find here? You're going to have a background, which is part of the introduction, which is answers the so what question. It sort of says, this is the why it's important. It is important because, and that's what we explain. Then you talk about some stuff about methods that you don't really need to know about, but you need to talk about it for those who are interested. Those 26 downloads, those are people who know what peak curving is, want to know how it's done, want to know the exact details, want to poke holes, and maybe see if they can do their own analysis that might find something different. And these are the ones who are also going to look at these graphs in great detail. By the way, these are all written in R using the plot function. But most people, if they're going to read it, they're going to go to the discussion, they're going to go to the conclusion, because that's sort of the broader story. Okay. I know that some of this might sound basic, but I think I'm saying this only because for a lot of students, we want to know what you say before you say it, because then we want, for those of us who are other data scientists, your peers, because we want to make sure that you're building what my advisor would call a watertight argument. Keep in mind, there's no such thing as a watertight argument. I would disagree with that. We just want to know how you came to what you did. And of course, this really depends on audience and standards and whom you'd really like to impress. So, for example, if your audience, it does not include people who are at all data scientists, if you don't have those kinds of people, if you're on a really short deadline, don't worry about it. Just give them the executive summary, show the figures, maybe give a couple sentences. Maybe your reputation or your background, your certification is important enough. That's important. That's right. The abstract exists for readers who want to know what they're going to read before they read it. I think of this as unlike a good mystery novel. Scientific papers should not surprise the reader with new findings or hypotheses not discussed in the introduction. So the point is, it's a weird way to write, at least for me, because a great novel will surprise you at the end. Oh, this is the cool finding. But the scientific or data analytic reader might even get upset. I've seen people who get upset because they're thinking, why didn't this person tell me this? First of all, the coolest finding is hidden. Second of all, I thought they were doing this, and now I have to reread the paper because now they're doing this, and I don't know if they did this well because I never knew. I assume some readers may only read the title of the abstract. Some will also read the introduction and conclusion, and only a few will read the methods and the data. It's kind of a funnel effect. I think they talk about it maybe in journalism. Although journalism, I think they talk about the triangle. The most important stuff is at the beginning. This is more like it's more framed. You have sort of the broader stuff at the beginning. You have the meat and potatoes, the real support material, and the discussion or conclusion you sort of repeat, and then you also address limitations. And I say only a few will read the methods and data because that's been my experience. Not everyone is interested or well-versed, not everyone has enough time. So while every finding needs to be sound, and when I mean sound, it just means that you've consciously made a decision to do something and you can try to explain it. You don't have to explain everything, but just sort of explain enough. You won't have, by the way, you won't have room to explain everything. So don't think of it. I don't like the idea of something being watertight because that's impossible. I'm going to talk a little bit about language when you revise this. Decide when and how to use jargon. I'm clearly quite often someone who uses jargon, whether it's a $10 word, maybe some Frenchism. That's, again, subjective, and some people will say never use jargon. I think it should serve a purpose, and just depends on the audience. Just be conscious of that. The jargon that we use is, in that paper, for example, is specific to that field. Again, I think when we talk about some jargon, it may not even be necessary. I'm trying to think of when it might not be. When it's already known, for example. I'm not sure. I can't think of the example. But the point is, there are some points to use jargon, or even like $10 words. I know if you're a psychologist, I've read a lot of professional societies will say you should never use big words when small words should be used. I disagree with that. Sometimes a nice big word is neat. It's kind of interesting. I remember reading a psychology paper where I had the longest word in the English language that is not technical. It's fluxinosinahilipilification, advanced psychology. That means you think you're worthless and everyone else is worthless. They were being a little funny. They put it in the footnote of the manuscript, probably just to see if people read it. But the point is that there's a reason to use jargon. And sometimes if you're going to speak metaphorically, it's helpful. Consider the benefits of specificity. You don't always have to be hyper-specific, but it's often useful to be transparent. I try to be most precise when formulating the hypothesis or when reporting the methods and results. This is like the middle meat of the research. When we talk about the conclusion, if you notice, like in the example paper that we have, it seems to be, I seem to have lost it. That's okay. If you just go to the end, you'll see Our findings, including modest support for the general literature on postural feedback and particularly strong effects for emotional and affective states, should encourage researchers who are investigating this area to continue doing so. We're not talking about which researchers. If you notice, there's plenty of jargon there, but it's jargon for people who are reading psychological science. It's the top psych journal. So they'll know the difference between emotional and affective states. That might sound redundant, by the way. If you're proofreading this, you might think it is, but we defined it differently. But we speak more generally about that. You can, talk about other things as well. But the point here is that that's when you can be more broad. But if you look at, like, say, the devil in the details, I'll go back to the paper. I just want to give you just a real quick example of where the specificity is in terms of the research reports. By the way, we use passive tense here. I don't like that all the time, but we did. We quote the other authors in very specific terms that we're responding to. And we do that quite extensively. And look, we're having p-values at 4 decimal places. We found the estimate of average power for the substudies was 44% in our main curve, and da-da-da in our blah, 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 compared with blah, blah, blah. We systematically identified current set of studies to p-curve analysis. We found the literature on positive possess evidential value. And then here's even more detail. Just lots of little numbers here. We even include an acronym for a group of types of variables. We have lots of stuff here. But the point is, that specificity helps because it's not only convincing, but it also lets other people know, okay, what studies did they do? How did they do it? And can I try to, if not replicate it, try to follow in their footsteps? And of course, we show that by also including footnotes. I'll show that to you. We cite the critics, we cite their blog post, right? Their posts that we're responding to, reassessing the evidence behind the most popular TED Talk. All materials have been made publicly available. You don't have to do this, of course, but we just did that. We talk about all this stuff here. And this is just a bunch of stuff that I'm even going to bother to read, but that's just like the almost like legalese detail you have to be. And that'll include jargon that's be very specific. Your standards are not nearly that strong at all, don't worry. But if you're going to revise, keep in mind you probably want to be more precise than less precise. I'm more concerned about language, actually, where when you talk about an association or a correlation, for example, between two variables, I like it when you talk about both variables. So I would avoid, for example, there was a positive association of income. Well, there's always an association between income or variable X and variable Y. So let's talk about that. So I would say reference the units of analysis is another example. And I would say that's really the most important part. And then you're talking about the tests that you use. But you don't have to be so hyper specific, but just make sure that you're using units of analysis that people can kind of understand what those variables are that are associated, whether there's a positive or negative association, whether or not it's linear. And related to that, this is a common issue that arises. If you notice that even when I read the conclusion, we concluded that our paper provided modest support. We supported a finding. We did not find any causal language. We did not use any causal language. We did not prove anything because science can't prove, because it is actually a kind of thinking about things that is inductive. Inductive logic, even though we use deductive hypotheses say we have a belief about the world and we're testing it. But the data are always inductive, which is to say it's not the kind of truth that you would find from mathematics. No matter what country you're from, no matter, technically, you could say, no matter what part of the known human universe that to our brains, we would always believe that 2 + 2 = 4. That is true by itself. You can deduce that if you take two of something and add 2, it'll always be 4. When you collect data, It's inductive because more data might always disprove what you're going to find. And time is also a variable. So a good example of that is not only when we talk about causality, but also when we talk about the limits of the fact that we're basing our conclusions on data and on inference, right? So even if you have a census, it's still an inference. Technically, I would say, you can describe, be more specific about the sample, but always be careful not to talk about, try to see if you can lighten the conclusions. You don't want to say you prove something, and when you talk about observational data, as opposed to causal data or experimental data, avoid causal language. Even if you have a theory of causality, which is okay, you can say poverty causes poor health, for example, when we look at the GSS data. That can be your theory. Because of my theory that poverty actually causes poor health, I'm going to test whether whether those variables are independent or not. Right? That's a condition. It's a necessary condition, but not sufficient. You need to have some correlation. You need some, but you also need some timing. It's not proof. Observational data are not causal proof, but they can be based in causal theories. The greatest example here is the fact that we've proven that smoking causes cancer. There's never been, as far as I know, there's never been an experimental study proving this. Never. They've all been observational. It's been the consistency of the correlations and the types of methods with observational data to show that lung cancer risks increase the more people smoke. Still, when you're going to write about this, let's say we're writing about smoking and lung cancer, you're going to talk and use the word association. So you want to say there's an association or there's a relation here between smoking and lung cancer, or it's a purport, or the data supports the conclusion that smoking is associated positively with cancer, or smoking increases the relative risk. We want to just hedge your language. I'd also say, I just sort of added this here, avoid contractions, even though I'm writing this here. So try to soften your language a little bit. It's just the way that we sort of write. And it's also because you can't prove anything definitively. In our response to those other authors who made a conclusion, I would say they made an overly strong conclusion that a field of research cannot be studied anymore based on 35 studies that weren't systematically evaluated. You can't do that, actually, because time is a variable. Research is always, science is always conditional. It's a way of thinking, but there are a lot of theories that have been disproven in the past, and there are a lot of theories that exist today that are revised and disproven. The other point is, in terms of you trying to minimize space, I think the biggest problem a lot of students face is they try to say too much. Use a table or figure if it says something. Avoid being what I would call an automated statistician. This is so easy to do, but I would say think about whether it's simply wasting space or communicating an effective message. This was clearly the case, I think, in the paper, the manuscript I wrote. I don't mean to toot my own horn here, even as third author. I helped with the analysis. We condensed this. We only have one figure here. And we describe what's going on. We use the version, blah, blah, blah. And then we have a little note here that basically describes what's going on. So we give it quite a bit of context. So it's not just plotted in there. I think it's a little noisy. But the reason it looks kind of like this is because we're actually doing using the same methods as these original authors. And that's, for whatever reason, they decided to represent the data this way, which I disagree with for several reasons. But the point is, we had so many more figures to present. We could have written a book about it, but we didn't. We wanted to present just what was necessary to show our points. And we wrote in the results section other findings that aren't there. And you can make a decision there, but just think about it. Again, no right or wrong. It's up to you. I say choose between active and passive voice. I gave you an example of passive voice there in that paper. I prefer active voice because I think it is clearer and more truthful to the process of the data analysis. However, and I'm being a little facetious here, passive voice has been used by many scientists. Many scientists it has been used by many scientists to give an air of objectivity, to have expressed oneself in passive voice. So passive voice simply is a way of trying to phrase your own analyses without putting you in the picture. There's a time and a place for that, but in my view, I would say active voice, I like it more. It might feel like it doesn't sound as objective, but as long as you're describing what you do and you avoid sentiments like I feel, I am, I believe, then I think you're okay, in my view. But again, that's your choice. Just make a decision about it, that's okay. And also be sure to use first person singular. This is a huge issue that I see among many students, maybe especially if English is not your second language or you work in a lab. I've worked with a lot of collaborators. Don't say we. You own the analysis, say you. The other issues to think about your tenses. This is actually really kind of frustrating when you review a paper. But most colleagues use past tense to describe their analyses and the research done by others. But when they talk about like endless truths or findings that kind of are durable, that exist forever, for all of time, or they talk about the conclusion, or they talk about the figures, they tend to use present tense. So you can switch between tenses, but just make sure you have an idea about that. It might be even something to sort of separate check. So for example, here's a good example of combining past and present tense. In sum, the results of our omnibus P-curve, our results, which included past tense, a systematically identified and comprehensive set of studies, demonstrate positive tense, softened language. We're not saying it proves, we're saying it demonstrates, it supports. It demonstrates that this literature possesses evidential value. Literature here, we're referring to the studies that look at this area of interest, our sample. So present tense, we're saying the evidence supports this. The evidence which was collected by us. This finding diverges. Again, we're staying in present tense. And again, here we present this, we present the results. But then you see here, you might go to past tense, right? Because if, you know, we can say, results did not meet this, it did not do that. So it sort of depends. We can say we present something, but then the results did not show this. This is why we did not do this. Let's see if I can find past tense. Yeah, in fact, we found evidential value. So again, we were being repetitive in terms of our results. We're sort of, you know, honing in on that fact that we found this. Let's see, I think our methodology is more here. 5 experts coded the variables, right? So we're talking about how different people coded this stuff and we selected this. So this is what we did. It's pretty nuts and bolts. That being said, don't worry too much about it, but I would do an independent review. Just make sure your tenses are making sense. Don't report the numbers and stats. I see this quite often. A lot of students will copy the H naught, H alternative, colon, and then include an equation there. I would say report the context and the meaning of those numbers. So in a sense, if you think about what statistics does, what our jobs are, we have data, which is what you see in the spreadsheet. You have maybe you have information, which is, you know, the data lake or the database. Then you want to, right, so you basically you have data that you want to translate to information. It's informative. And you want to translate that information, these stats, into knowledge. Knowledge is what essentially the story you're telling about this. This is almost like the way I think of it a lot like journalism, in the sense that you might collect quotes, you might collect contacts, and then you can synthesize that into something that is based in reality. That is a kind of knowledge. Provisional always, and that's why you can talk about limitations, but it's a kind of knowledge. Even no matter what you find, you're going to find something, and that's always knowledge. Even a null finding tells us something. The data always speak. Don't be afraid. And I'm saying don't be afraid because I used to be afraid of looking at results because I would want one kind of result over another. I want my hypothesis to be supported. The more times you do this, the more comfortable you will get in terms of being more Zen-like, how to stop worrying and love the data, and love the results, rather. But I also mean this in terms of some simple, more meaningful terms. When we talk about translating the data set into knowledge, don't use the data set names, like the variable names, and don't present code in your write-up. So for example, in here, we have code, we have it online, we have a data set with using our names. If we use the GSS health data, don't use the names that are provided in the data set. Those are in-house. Those are like if this were a restaurant, those belong in the kitchen. Those are not what you serve on the dinner table. What you serve on the dinner table is perhaps filet mignon with patate au gratin, right? What you serve in the back of the house is, I don't know, one steak, medium rare, and I don't know, the thing on the third shelf of the freezer, and nuke it. Just don't include the back end stuff. We don't, like, if you're going to use the name Inc., write income, and if you're going to use income, tell us whether it's in dollars, pounds, adjusted, blah blah blah. We don't need that. We don't want to see the code as syntax. And I've also seen some students provide example rows of the data set. Nope, that's for you to summarize and to interpret for us. That's the story. It also shortens your paper, makes your life easier. Less written is less stress. Less stated is actually more clearly stated. That's okay. When you get into the world of science, there's increasing demand to put it on an external supplemental web page, which is insane, because then people will always ask for more stuff. If you feel like this is the case, give me an appendix and do that if I'm grading your paper. If I'm not grading your paper, and Regan is your TA, then I would consult her, but I would say, if in doubt, I would follow the guidelines we provide. The other piece of advice I have is interpret the substantive significance in addition to statistical significance. Whether or not you provide statistical significance according to a p-value doesn't mean anything. I don't know what if someone says the Earth is round, p is less than 0.05, I don't know what that means. I don't care. And I know it's difficult, but when we talk about substantive significance, you want to say that you want to go back to your first half of the course and say not only whether or not the difference is statistically significant, but regardless, what are the actual differences? Do the differences support your data? Is the difference large? Is the confidence interval large? Is the confidence interval small? The p-value by itself is useful, but there's so much more in the data that even if you have a null hypothesis, you actually might have more support of the data than you would think otherwise, because there are different ways to have a null hypothesis. You can have a null hypothesis because why? Because there are confounders, because your confidence interval is really large, but there's a huge objective difference. You might have a null hypothesis because it's very precise. The confidence interval is really, really tiny, and the substantive differences are very small. So the difference is around 0. So null hypothesis can mean many different things. The only way you can really understand that is interpret the descriptive data. So this is when you get back to the descriptive stuff, and even maybe include confidence intervals. And just tell the story here. I call it narrating the null. Don't give up if you have a null finding. That's okay. Then what you say is, don't sell yourself short. Tell us what's going on with what you think is going on, really. I want to say this because I think so many academics, so many data scientists, so many people who are going to read this, if you're going into a data science job, this will be your project, part of your portfolio. There are always critics and there are always flaws and limitations, and that's okay. For me, I acknowledge and address them to deal with them, especially if I do not have time to address every concern or it's not possible. There's the myth of the perfect analysis. There's no such thing as the perfect analysis. The first example of analysis of variance, for example, was flawed because it had, this is by R.A. Fisher, by the way, one of the founders of statistics, considered a genius. He didn't graph his data, and he showed that his statistically significant results from his analysis of variance were a result, an artifact of some outliers, that once you remove the outlier, you realize there's no difference. Now, his paper was to illustrate the fact that analysis of variance is a useful tool, but his incidental finding was flawed. Okay, well, keep that in mind. And the point you want to make here is don't go through an apology tour. Don't worry about it. Everyone's flawless. Science is a human endeavor. We try to minimize it, but no data set hypothesis, an unbiased approach can entirely remove the role of chance. That is, even if you had the perfect analysis, which is impossible, you're still going to have the type 1 or type 2 error if you do inferential statistics. That is a result of chance. We have not learned enough techniques to make your analysis even more bulletproof against any possible problem in the research process. But really, just fundamentally, you can't remove the possibility of a false positive or a false negative, a type 2 error. Now, the reason we call it type 1 and type 2 is we typically are often more worried about type 1 errors. We're worried about stating something to be statistically significant when it is not. That's actually the origin of it. That's, again, another kind of a human evaluation that exists that's conventional. But the point is that a difference can occur in your sample by chance, and it's not your fault. It's okay. But I think, and you can't always even address every concern, but if you think there's some major concerns, address those and say, well, that's beyond the scope of this analysis, or there are some limitations to this. These are areas for future research. That's how I try to frame it more positively, in the sense that there are areas of future research, or this is beyond the scope of the analysis. So you can basically, in the conclusion, you can say, repeat what you found in perhaps more broad terms, brag about it, don't undersell yourself, acknowledge the limitations, and communicate to the reader that you're aware of these, that you're knowledgeable. That's the real point here. It's also to communicate to your colleagues that, hey, look, there's some other cool stuff we can do if we can address these issues. Maybe if you give me tons of money, maybe if we work on this together, we can do this. That's why even a null finding is good. You can tell why. You'd explain to, say, people who are funding an intervention program why it doesn't work, or what are some problems with measurement. You can explain some limitations or areas of improvement. I wouldn't call them limitations. I'll call them like areas of future research, or limitations, maybe limitations. But it's a way of that. It's a way of acknowledging it and demonstrating your expertise, essentially. But that being said, don't end on your limitations and say, that's it. Say, these are the limitations. Despite these limitations, this research has implications for blah, 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 right? So maybe in your last sentence, you could just say, this has provided a novel introduction or conclusion, or provides evidence for this. Try to upsell it, right? In a way, you're selling your story. Don't oversell, but don't be too hard on yourself. Less is more. You only have 5 pages if you're an undergraduate, and it's from the paper. Don't worry about it. Don't think you need to discover the polio vaccine. I've always seen students take on too much. Less is more. If in doubt, cut it out. With one test, I would say you could do one test. You take the GSS health data, you look at women, you do a t-test of differences in health, and you say, oh, well, I want to look at women. And this is important because women's health there are many reasons to say that. And then if you do that, you'll have more space just to thoroughly explain these things. I know I've been guilty of taking on too much, so I understand and empathize with the difficulty, but it's surprisingly easy to fill 5 to 10 pages with writing. Behooves you to leave space to be more elaborate as well. I'm looking at that paper 17 pages. That's a commentary. That was way too long, and it's, you know, in a 5-page paper, if you have every page with text, which you won't, that's 1,600 words. That's like a long Huffington Post article. That's like a parenting blog thing with statistics. So less is more, and you can take up more space with figures. So that being said, you can't just include your null and alternative hypothesis without using human language. You can't say the null hypothesis is that all the means or all the proportions are equal. The alternative is that they're not equal. No, you can include that, but then you have to use human language and communicate the ideas. That's knowledge. I'm going to tell you proofreading tonight. I read aloud the manuscripts that I've written, or I have others read them, especially people who are not in the field, or both, because it is easy to miss the little aspects of the writing if you're too familiar with it, and you're going to be sick of it at some points, and maybe you already are. But I almost always read it aloud. Another thing that I do, of course, you can do spell check and grammar check, is I will actually, if I don't have time, say you get 5 minutes to submit it, what I'll do on the paper is actually I will kind of, in a way, read backwards. I'm kind of reading like right to left and going up, looking for kind of spelling errors, because that way you're not using your own voice. Because if you use your own voice, you can often interpolate or include extra words, and you're not seeing the mistakes here. Of course, it's always useful, and the reason I read it aloud is simply because it's easier to force yourself to hear those mistakes. Those are just some examples. I don't endorse anything, but there are some cool apps there. There's one called Grammarly that I found to be useful, and another one called a Hemingway app. These are good for Macintosh computers. I think use them on what is it? What was I going to say? Well, I'll show you what Grammarly is in a way. Grammarly is pretty useful. You can see this, it sort of corrects some stuff. You can add it to Chrome. I don't even know if I've added it. I know that's very useful. If you want more simple parsed down language, there's also something called the Hemingway app. If you know of Ernest Hemingway's writing, he actually has a style of writing that is very simple. So if you really want to have as simple language as possible, we'll put my own text here. I guarantee you I'm not very good at being a good Hemingway guy. So already they want us to use fewer adverbs. I didn't use any passive voice, so they like to use active voice. So I say readability is pretty good. Some of these phrases can be simpler. So that's another thing too, by the way. Sometimes you can break up phrases. I tend to have really long, complex phrases. But that's also my writing style. So Hemingway.app.com, you can just cut and paste, and you can also edit that stuff out. So why do they not like this? Adverb. Yeah. So why do we want to avoid adverbs? Because an adverb is you can always use a strong verb instead of an adverb. I'm not sure what to use there though, to be honest. With the test of one thoroughly written and justified. Yeah, see, that's not even well written. See, I'm already identifying it. And even I would say provide yourself. Anyway, with one strong test, with one strong statistical test, how about this? You can say this. You can see, okay. It is often preferable to write, to focus on one strong statistical test. With fewer tests, you have more space. to elaborate on your results. See? Actually, that is better, right? So I kind of like the Hemingway app. It's already went down to grade 6. If you've read Hemingway, it's often, relatively simple writing, but also very effective. Yeah, so some people are saying there are areas of future research. Don't concern yourself if there are future areas of research and you've already written more and you're thinking about this and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to rewrite the paper or do anything like that. Don't worry about that. This is more for those of you who might want to have this kind of advice just to give it another look-see, as I would say it. But look, here I am rewriting something that clearly is not working. And I've used passive voice myself. There's no perfect analysis. In fact, perfection is going to be probably going to be an issue, I think, if we think about statistics, because there's no such thing as perfect statistics. You're going to get criticized, and to be honest, being criticized is good because it means people are reading your paper. They aren't just reading your abstract. But I would say less is more. And I do know for a fact that I don't write like Hemingway. Maybe I should. But anyway, I think it all depends. So Hemingway.app.com, Grammarly I don't use, but it's sort of I don't know. You can add it as an app. Anyway, those are 2 bits of advice that I have. Again, reading aloud is always useful, especially when you're going to have these numbers and statistics. It's just like that's an issue to deal with. Notice I've never really tried to say that you do one thing or another. Just if you want to review the paper, there are different ways to do it. Read it aloud. Make sure you're telling the story. Make sure that you sell it on something that's good. I wanted to show you something else. And now we're a little bit over, but I want to emphasize this. Effective, clear writing in science and in data science isn't that common. So it's not like we're looking at you to be the next Hemingway. In fact, I think my writing has deteriorated since graduate school. But that's because it's a style of writing that isn't always very useful. I just want to show you a paper here that I'm going to share with the class if you're interested, but I know you won't have time to read it. I thought it was a good commentary I just found. The art of writing science. Notice they're calling it an art here. I think data science isn't exactly that, but this person is speaking to chemists. But the point is, I think this is correct. The title should headline the main result described in the paper, not the main effort. That is to say, a title describes what you did. A phylogenetic analysis of humans and chimps. I've been guilty of that, I'm sure. What does that say? It tells me nothing. It'll attract far fewer readers than a title that describes what you learned. Phylogenetic evidence indicates, by the way, notice he's using language that is softened a bit. An exceptionally close relationship between humans and chimps. So at the one moment, you're saying it indicates something. On the other hand, he's really selling it up. He's upselling an exceptionally close relationship. That's kind of cool. Journalists will pick that up. They'll disseminate it. I don't like his use of above and beyond, but again, that's a style issue. I think of that as a military term. This person says he tries to use as broad title as he can reasonably get away with. That's whatever you want. I could imagine that the case. If you notice, you'll hear this quite a lot. We often talk about, for some reason in science, something to be sexy. It's not be sexist to say that, but we'll often say it's a sexy title, it's a sexy punchline, it's a sexy data set. It's just a weird term that you'll see quite often. It just means good, punchy, cool, memorable. Yeah, this person actually more clearly describes it. The introduction has precisely one purpose: to convince your readers that they should read your paper. To do so, you must first convince your readers that you have identified an important, open, scientific question that they should care about. Following this, it should prime your readers to expect an answer to that question, encouraging them to read on. The whole expectation here is that no one's going to read your paper. Why? Because science is dull, it's boring, it's complicated. There's a lot being produced. A highly cited scientific article might have, I think, 1,000 citations. We live in a world of 7.5 billion people. 1,000 citations is good. Sometimes it's not how many people read it, but who reads it. But just keep that in mind. Most papers, I don't think they're read. If you look at errors in reporting of statistics, they're very, very common in terms of just typos and things like that. So I'm not asking you to go beyond like some of the standards here, but I've seen typos in academic papers too. Okay, so he talks about the inverted pyramid issue, right? You have sort of more general thing in the introduction, you have the specificities, then you have the conclusion. He's talking about an academic paper here, but I think this is still useful. He emphasizes figures. Often it depends on your audience. In my field, we don't really like figures. We like to have precise numbers. I do want to emphasize in this paper more on the abstract, what he says about the abstract. He says he reports it last rather than first because the abstract is the entire paper in brief. That's exactly the case. I think of it as a press release. I think I've been told to describe it as a press release. And he says, he places it at the end because it is perhaps the single most important element in a paper. It will, after all, be read far more often than the paper it describes. Indeed, a badly written abstract almost guarantees that no one will read the paper itself. And again, to underscore this, if you look at that discrepancy, 1,300 people read the abstract of this paper that we posted online, 26 downloaded it. I mean, that discrepancy is science in a nutshell. And we had a long abstract, by the way, because it was a big, important issue. You don't have to do that, but I think he's right. You should start with a very blunt sentence. Try 3 sentences. Oh, well, he has another rule. Ignore any rule if it makes the paper easier to read. I think that's true too. You know, to a certain extent. I mean, again, if you look at my manuscript where you talk about data science, there is a level of technicality, like phylogenetic, whatever it is, that is not going to be a household term, right? Again, that depends on the audience. This is not that clear. I don't know what a dichroism spectrum of native site C, unless that's a bad example. Oh, in fact, it is. Circular dichromatism spectroscopy demonstrates that. Okay, so he gave an example of what looks like a bad caption figure and a good one. Anyway, he's actually right here. So I'll post these as files, but the point is, you can be clear, but keep in mind you're still going to be technical, and it's again up to you. And the standards aren't that high in academic writing, to be honest. Anyway, I hope this helps with review. And I said as easy as possible. Sorry, I said as easy as possible, but keep in mind, I'm not your typical audience. When I'm grading the paper, I will be interested in what you have to say, and my goal is to give you feedback as I do it, because I'm not a researcher, I'm not a critic, I'm not responding, I'm not going to be the person responding to the people who've already responded to their response to our response. You know, the paper that we've just published, or that's forthcoming, they've already written a response to it. I'm not that kind of person. I don't play any stakes in the field. My goal is simply, I would hope, this is what I want you to feel. I want you to feel comfortable stating yourself and being yourself. Basically, like an old mentor of mine who used to be a journalist, I asked him, why did he write these fancy books? You know, when he's the one who talked about the title of the ages. He said, he was 90 years old, he shrugged his shoulders, he's from Brooklyn, because I had something to say. Okay, maybe you don't have something to say, but the data have something to say, and that's what we want to hear. Okay, good luck with everything. Tomorrow, 3 to 5, we're gonna focus on the review. It's review week. It's cramming time. I know not everyone has time to do that, and I will give you an additional links for the YouTube tutorial. The YouTube sections, and you can watch all of them, but I watch them twice as fast.
Hey, Dr. Foxy, quick question.
Anyway, thank you very much, and I'm going to post this as soon as I get back online. Thank you very much.
Hey, Dr. Foxy, hello.
Any other questions? I hope that's useful. Just to let you know, I do know when some of you have submitted your papers, but technically you can resubmit if you want with this advice in mind. And I'm going to see if I can actually attach to this. Share file. I'm going to attach this manuscript as well as the other one because I have to run out and get a Mac cable. This is just the bane of my existence. Seriously, I have a cable that used to work, and then I went on a plane and it doesn't. Sure, someone's asking for a couple minutes afterwards. Definitely. So I want to give you these links. There's Hemingway app. Here is Grammarly. So keep in mind, I wrote a dissertation using the without using the that app, but I don't know. I have to say that again. There is a certain amount of style here. Again, I will probably always be the person who uses large sentences. My girlfriend, who's French, and it's a very French thing to do, by the way. They will definitely write their sentences with little brick by brick by brick. There was actually an article that basically said how impossible it is for the French to translate American President Trump's tweets, because he tends to probably have long, elaborate sentences. I'm gonna attach those other files if you're still here. I know there are some of you still waiting, so let me get those. Sorry, hold on for a second. I don't know if you want this. This is not really that relevant as an example, but just a good example of differences between abstracts and the actual paper. And now I'll go here and I'll go to let's see. Let me make sure I close everything. I'm sorry. Are there any other questions as I'm here? Trying to close these files. How are you feeling about the final exam?
Scored an 84 without before my review. Started last night.
Okay. So I'm gonna post those and I'll make an announcement for that too. Okay, Walter, you're here.